Something was wrong the moment they stepped through the gate. Detective Sergeant Lena Marsh had been to this property before. She had walked these same gravel paths, ducked under the same low-hanging oak branches, stood in this same overgrown patch of yard where the ground was soft from weeks of rain. She knew this place. She had catalogued it, photographed every inch of it, and then watched it get sealed off with yellow tape that had since gone pale from sun exposure. That was 11 days ago. She wasn't supposed to feel anything unusual returning here. Follow-up visits were routine. You check the perimeter, verify no environmental disturbance, confirm the tape is intact, and leave. 20 minutes, maybe 30. That was the plan. But Detective Marsh stopped walking about halfway across the yard. Her partner, Officer Dale Renner, almost walked into her. He asked what was wrong. She didn't answer right away. She was staring at a section of earth near the base of an old wooden fence post. The same fence post where, 11 days earlier, a small metal object had been found half buried in the mud. She had collected it herself. She had placed it into an evidence bag. She had pressed the seal. She had photographed it in her hands, with the date card visible, before handing it to the evidence technician waiting at the perimeter. She had done everything right, which is why what she was looking at right now made absolutely no sense. There it was, sitting in almost the exact same position, partially pressed into the soft earth, slightly tilted, just as it had been before. The same dull metallic surface, the same irregular shape, the same faint discoloration along one edge that had made it stand out from the surrounding debris in the first place. Renner saw it too, and immediately went quiet. Neither of them touched it. Marsh reached for her radio without taking her eyes off the object. She spoke slowly, her voice lower than normal, choosing each word carefully, as if speaking too quickly might cause the thing to disappear. She said she needed a supervisor out of the property on Callaway Road. She said it was urgent. She said there was something at the scene that shouldn't be there. The dispatcher asked her to clarify. She paused for just a moment before she answered. She said that the evidence was back. To understand what that moment meant, you need to go back to the beginning. Not because the beginning is simple, but because the beginning is the only place where things still made sense. The call came in on a Tuesday evening, just after 7 o'clock. A neighbor named Gerald Poole had noticed the side gate to the property at 12 Callaway Road had been left wide open for several days. He knew the owner, an older man named Arthur Vess, who lived alone and kept irregular hours. But 3 days of an open gate was unusual. Poole called it in as a welfare concern. When officers arrived, they found no sign of Arthur Vess inside the house. The front door was unlocked. A meal had been partially prepared on the kitchen counter and left there, apparently untouched for some time. A chair in the living room was knocked onto its side. There was nothing definitive, nothing that immediately screamed violence or forced entry, but the combination of details was enough to escalate the response. Within 2 hours, Callaway Road was a crime scene. The investigation that followed was handled professionally, by the book, the way every serious scene should be handled. The yard was processed systematically. Photographs first, then measurements, then evidence collection, working from the outside perimeter inward toward the house. Detective Marsh and her team spent most of that first night outside, working by artificial light, cataloging everything that might be relevant. Soil disturbance near the fence line, a partial footprint in a muddy patch near the rear gate, several items of debris that had no obvious explanation. And then there was the object near the fence post. It was small, roughly the size of a thumb, metal, possibly brass or a similar alloy. Irregular in shape, not quite like anything they could immediately identify in the field. There was what appeared to be a partial marking on one surface, worn almost entirely smooth by either time or deliberate effort. It was partially embedded in the mud, as if it had been pressed down with some force, or had been there long enough for the ground to slowly absorb it. Marsh logged it. She photographed it. She bagged it. She handed it to evidence technician Ryan Coates at 9:47 in the evening. He signed for it. And that, everyone assumed, was that. The object was gone from the scene, stored, secured, part of the official record of the investigation. And yet, 11 days later, there it was again, waiting. The call reached Detective Captain Howard Bellamy at his desk just after 11 in the morning. He listened without interrupting. When Marsh finished explaining what she had found, Bellamy asked her one question. He asked if she was absolutely certain it was the same object. She told him she hadn't touched it. She hadn't moved it. She had photographed it where it lay and stepped back to wait. But yes, she said. She was certain. Bellamy told her to secure the area. He said he was sending a second evidence team to the scene. And then he called the evidence room. The evidence room at the precinct was managed by Sergeant Diane Mall. She had been running the room for over 11 years. She was meticulous, well-regarded, and deeply protective of her domain. Every item that entered her inventory was accounted for. Every movement was documented. Every bag had a seal number that was logged independently from the bag itself. When Bellamy reached her and explained the situation, she told him that was impossible. He asked her to check. She walked to the storage locker assigned to the Callaway Road investigation. Case reference number, storage bay designation, individual bag seal number. She read each one back to him as she verified them. The bag was there. The seal was intact, unbroken. She described it to him in detail. The bag number matched the log. The date stamp matched the entry record. The initials on the evidence tag matched the technician who had processed it. Everything, every single thing, was exactly as it should be. Bellamy hung up and stared at his desk for a long moment. Then he drove to Callaway Road himself. He stood in that yard and looked at the object in the mud. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. He had been doing this work for over 2 decades. He had seen confusing cases. He had seen evidence mishandled, mislabeled, and lost. He had seen administrative errors that seemed impossible until someone found the simple human mistake buried under the paperwork. He had never seen anything like this. He told Marsh to treat the second object as new evidence, full processing, full documentation. He wanted the chain of custody on this one to be flawless. Every photograph, every signature, every timestamp. And then he wanted the original bag pulled from storage and photographed on the evidence room table, seal intact for the record. Because what he needed more than anything right now was proof that both objects actually existed at the same time. Side by side on the examination table, the 2 bags looked almost identical. The objects inside them were compared carefully, first through the sealed plastic without opening either, and then by forensic examiner Patricia Holt, who was brought in specifically because of the unusual nature of the situation. She had been briefed beforehand, but she later said that no amount of preparation could have made that moment feel normal. The objects were extraordinarily similar. Same approximate dimensions, same metallic composition, which a preliminary field test suggested was consistent with a brass alloy or similar material. Same irregular, almost organic shape that resisted easy categorization. The partial marking on the surface appeared on both objects, in the same location, worn to the same degree of smoothness. They were not identical in every microscopic detail. Holt was careful to note that. Under magnification, there were small variations in surface texture and minor differences in the depth of the partial marking. These were differences that could result from two separate manufacturing processes or from two objects that had experienced different environmental exposures over time. But to the naked eye, standing in that room, looking at both bags at once, the effect was deeply disorienting. It was like looking at the same object twice. Holt noted something else that made the room go quiet. The soil present on the second object, the one found at the scene on day 11, was consistent with the soil from the Callaway Road property. That alone wasn't shocking. What was notable was the depth of that soil in the surface imperfections of the object. It suggested the second object had been in contact with that specific ground for a significant period of time. Not days, possibly weeks. Which raised a question that nobody wanted to say out loud at first, but that eventually Bellamy put into words during the debrief. If the second object had been in that ground for weeks, and the original object had been collected from what appeared to be the same location 11 days ago, how had the original collection missed it? Had it not been there yet? Or had it always been there, and no one had seen it? Every camera in and around the Callaway Road property had been reviewed after the initial discovery. That was standard. But now, with a second anomaly to account for, a more exhaustive review began. Every frame from every available source was re-examined with fresh attention. There were 3 external cameras associated with neighboring properties that had any angle toward 12 Callaway Road. One belonged to Gerald Poole, the neighbor who had made the initial welfare call. His doorbell camera covered a partial view of the street, and, if you pushed the digital zoom to its limit, an oblique sliver of the far end of the Callaway yard near the front gate. The second camera was mounted on a utility pole, roughly 40 meters down the road. It was a maintenance camera operated by the County Infrastructure Department, and it pointed primarily down the road surface, but its field of view clipped the top edge of the Callaway fence line at a distance. The third was an older, lower-resolution security camera on the property directly behind 12 Callaway, belonging to a retired couple named the Dunforths. It pointed at their own rear garden, but given the properties shared a rear boundary, a corner of the Callaway yard was faintly visible in the background. None of the footage showed anyone entering or exiting the Callaway Road property during the period in question. Not through the front gate, not through the rear, not over the fence. Investigators also reviewed all access records for the precinct evidence room. Biometric entry logs, swipe card records, supervisor sign-in sheets, and the internal camera mounted above the evidence room door. The footage showed Sergeant Mall entering and exiting as expected, a junior officer who had signed in to retrieve an unrelated item, a routine inspection visit from a senior administrator. Nobody had accessed the locker assigned to the Callaway case since the night the evidence was logged. There were no gaps in the footage, no corrupted timestamps, no unexplained periods of darkness or signal loss. Bellamy reviewed the summary report alone in his office late on a Thursday evening. He read through it twice, then a third time, slowing down on the sections he had hoped might offer something new. They didn't. He closed the file and looked out his window at the parking lot below, where the lights were beginning to flicker on in the early dusk. Nothing showed anyone near that yard. Nothing showed anyone near that locker. And yet something, somewhere, had gone very, very wrong. The mystery of the object existed inside a larger mystery. A man was still missing. Arthur Vess was 63 years old at the time of his disappearance, He had lived at 12 Callaway Road for over 2 decades. Neighbors described him as private, not unfriendly, but guarded in the way some people become after years of living alone. He had no immediate family in the area. A sister lived several hundred miles away and had not spoken to him in approximately 8 months. His phone was found inside the house. His car was in the driveway. His wallet, with identification and card still inside, was on the kitchen table beside the unfinished meal preparation. There was no sign that he had packed anything. No empty drawers, no missing luggage. Nothing suggested a voluntary departure. His background, when investigators dug into it, produced a profile that was unusual in one particular respect. Arthur Vess had, for a period of roughly 15 years, worked as a craftsman who specialized in the restoration and reproduction of antique metalwork. He had run a small workshop at a previous address before moving to Callaway Road, where he had continued working independently on private commissions. The business had wound down gradually over several years, for reasons that appeared to be purely economic. He had not maintained a formal workshop since moving in. But there were records of his work, and some of those records, once investigators began reviewing them with new attention, produced an unexpected development. Metalwork, small components, brass alloys. The partial marking on the surface of the objects at the examination table was re-examined with that context in mind. What had been assumed to be simple wear or an indeterminate stamp began to look, under closer scrutiny, like it might be something more deliberate. Something that a person with knowledge of antique marking systems would recognize. It looked like it might be a maker's mark, and if it was a maker's mark, then it might be possible to determine who had made the objects. For the first time in days, the investigation had a direction. But what it would find at the end of that direction, nobody was ready for. The partial marking was sent for specialist analysis. A consultant named Dr. Evelyn Sarp, who worked with the Regional Museum's Conservation Department and had spent over 30 years studying antique metalwork and historical craft signatures, was brought in to examine the objects. She asked for time alone with them. When she emerged from the examination room 2 hours later, she looked composed, but spoke carefully, as if measuring every sentence before releasing it. She said she believed the marking was consistent with the type of workshop identifier used by small independent metalworkers during a specific period, roughly spanning the 1970s through the early 2000s. Not an officially registered trademark or guild mark, but a personal signature style. Individual craftsmen who worked outside formal commercial structures sometimes developed these, she explained. Idiosyncratic, deliberately obscure, meaningful only to the maker and perhaps a small community of collectors or clients who knew their work. She said she could not definitively identify whose mark it was from the partial impression alone. But she said there was a pattern in the marking, a specific combination of angles in the remaining visible portion, and she had seen something similar before. She had seen it in a collection of metalwork pieces that had passed through an estate sale approximately 4 years earlier. She remembered it because the pieces were unusual, technically skilled but deliberately anachronistic, styled to evoke an older period than they actually came from. They had been attributed at the time to an independent craftsman whose name she had not retained, but whose work had been flagged by one of her colleagues as particularly accomplished. She thought her colleague might still have notes from that evaluation. Bellamy had someone on the phone within the hour. The colleague confirmed the collection, confirmed the marking style, and then provided a name that had been attached to the estate sale provenance records. The name was Arthur Vess. The room went completely still. The objects found at the scene, both of them, appeared to have been made by the man who had disappeared from that scene. And now the question was no longer just where Arthur Vess had gone. The question was why his own work had appeared twice in the mud outside his own home. A more thorough search of 12 Callaway Road was authorized. What they found changed the texture of everything. In the basement of the property, behind a section of shelving that appeared to be a permanent fixture, investigators discovered a concealed workspace. It was small, maybe 3 meters by 4, accessible through a gap in the shelving that was invisible unless you knew to look for it, or unless the shelving was moved entirely from the wall. Inside were the tools and materials of a metalworking practice. A small forge, no longer active but clearly used with some regularity. Finishing tools, casting materials, a workbench with a surface worn smooth by years of use. And on that bench, a series of objects in various stages of completion. Several of them resembled the objects already in evidence. Same shape, same alloy, same partial marking pressed into the surface at the same location. The workshop had been in operation recently. The dust patterns on the bench surface suggested someone had been working there within the past several weeks. And then, investigators found something else. A notebook. It was small, bound in dark cloth, and had been tucked into a gap beneath the workbench surface. Inside, written in a careful, deliberate hand, were entries that appeared to be a personal log. Not a diary in any conventional sense, more like records. Notes made alongside dates, quantities, and brief descriptions. Most of the entries were technical: materials used, hours worked, dimensions recorded. But 3 entries near the end of the notebook were different in character. They were written in a more fragmented way, shorter sentences, wide gaps between lines, as if the writer had paused for long stretches between words. One entry, dated approximately 3 weeks before the initial welfare call, contained a phrase that investigators kept returning to. It said, in full, that they had been back to look, that the first one had been moved, that he had put another in the same place so they would know he had seen them do it. He had put another one in the same place. He had done it deliberately. Someone had moved the first object, Vess had noticed, and he had replaced it. But who had moved it? And where had the original gone? The notebook entry rewrote the shape of everything investigators thought they understood. Arthur Vess had not simply disappeared. He had been watching something, or someone. And whatever he had been watching had apparently come to his property before his disappearance, had moved something he had placed there deliberately, and had caused him enough concern to document it in that fragmented, careful handwriting. The implication was stark. The first object, the one Marsh had collected on the night of the initial investigation, might not have been the original one placed by Vess. It might have been his replacement, his signal, which meant there had been an object there before, an earlier one, placed by Vess for an unknown reason, that someone else had retrieved. Someone who had come to that yard without authorization, without being seen on any available footage, without leaving a trace that investigators had identified. A second search of the exterior of the property focused on the area around the fence post with new specificity. Ground-penetrating equipment was brought in. What they found, approximately 18 centimeters below the surface, roughly 2 meters from the fence post, was unexpected. A third object. Identical in construction to the other 2. Same material, same shape, same partial marking. But this one had been deliberately buried. Not pressed into the surface mud. Buried, with soil packed down above it in a way that was inconsistent with natural settling. Someone had dug a small hole, placed the object, filled the hole, and walked away. The question of who that someone was became urgent again, because the buried object, based on the soil compaction analysis, had been placed underground approximately 6 to 8 weeks before the initial welfare call. That meant it had been there before Vess was reported missing, possibly before the events in the notebook entries, possibly before any of this had come to anyone's attention at all. 3 objects, made by Arthur Vess, placed in and around the same location at different times. One buried deep, one on the surface that had apparently been moved by an unknown party, one placed as a replacement signal, and Arthur Vess, still missing. Still nowhere. The Callaway Road investigation remained open. In the weeks that followed, every thread that looked like it might lead somewhere eventually stopped short of resolution. Dr. Sarp confirmed with high confidence that all 3 objects were consistent with Vess's metalwork style and his preferred materials, but she could not confirm with certainty that he had made them without an authenticated comparison piece from his documented output. The estate sale records that might have provided that comparison piece had been incomplete, and the current owner of the collection they were associated with could not be located. The notebook was analyzed extensively. The handwriting was confirmed as consistent with documents attributed to Vess, but the entries were too vague to extract actionable information. They referenced no names, no specific individuals, no identifiable locations beyond the property itself. They referred to they without ever defining who they were. The surveillance gap remained unexplained. Every frame from every available camera during the period in question was reviewed a final time by a specialist brought in from a regional forensics unit. The specialist confirmed there were no anomalies in the footage. No gaps, no tampering, no signs of digital interference. The footage simply showed nothing. Arthur Vess was never found. No remains, no contact, no confirmed sightings. The investigation into his disappearance remained classified as an active missing persons case, technically open, functionally stalled. The 3 metal objects were retained in evidence storage, logged separately, each in its own sealed bag, each with its own unbroken chain of custody. They sat in Sergeant Mall's carefully organized evidence room, alongside the remnants of dozens of other investigations. Unremarkable in appearance. Impossible to explain. Detective Marsh returned to Callaway Road one final time, unofficially, about 3 months after the initial call. The property had been released from restriction by then. The tape was gone. The yard looked the same as it must have looked before any of this began. Just overgrown grass, soft ground, the old fence post tilted slightly in the earth. She stood near the spot where she had found the second object. She looked at the ground for a long time. And then she noticed something she had not seen before. Or perhaps it had not been there before. She could not be certain. A small, circular depression in the mud near the base of the fence post. Recent, based on its sharpness. The size and shape of something small and round, pressed deliberately into the earth, and then removed. She called it in. No one could explain it. No one ever did. The world is full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join me as we explore the stories that hide in plain sight. Some of them might haunt you.